grew up in and around a farm, you know that oftentimes the farmers were given to knowing about rising up early, and that was given to them mainly because of this whole concept of roosters. You know, roosters are supposed to have internal clocks, and they're the ones that at dawn kind of do their little squawking. At least that's my interpretation of it. But most of us have grown up with some form of an alarm clock, whether it be the old-fashioned kind with the little bells on top of it, or it be a radio that would blare for us. But this week, as you might know, I've been doing some studying, and I want you to admit right here before God whether or not you are a snoozer. Are you one that hits the snooze every morning? I see those hands. Now, how many of you are lying? I mean, you just didn't do that, okay? But snoozing is a new concept, at least within all the possibilities. What we have found out, and I've done the research this week, is that we tend to think, mine set for somewhere between 5 and 9 minutes, we think that we're only going to hit it once, when in reality the average time is usually we hit it 5 to 6 times, and that we sleep an extra 30 minutes. What I have found interesting about that is that it's not really good for us. That I've often believed that the reason I wanted to do it was I wanted to know that I woken up and I got to go back to sleep. I mean, there was something about, okay, I woke up, I was conscious, now I get to go back to sleep. You got to get to shake your fist at the sunlight for just a brief moment, and then 5 minutes later, you wake up. Well, let me give you what you've always dreamed about, a alarm clock that will definitely get you up. Look first of all at the puzzle alarm clock. That's right, that is a real alarm clock. Now, if you grew up with the game Perfection, you know that the game Perfection is you have to put in those little figures, and they fit in a certain hole that fits the size right. You have a certain amount of time to do that, or it goes off. Well, in this case, when that one goes off, it throws those 3 pieces out, and you have to collect the pieces and literally put them in for it to shut up. Some of you are heading online as soon as church is over to get you one of those. The next one is the laser target alarm clock. That's right. The alarm goes off, and you have to pretend you are Star Wars, I guess, and you get your pistol, and with a laser, you have to hit the center of that for the alarm to finally go to sleep. I know. You think, Dan, what do you do with your time, Dan? Then there's the flying alarm clock. Now, if you're into Harry Potter, this might fit really well with you. But it literally flies off, and if you can grab it, immediately it will stop, although I think the thing is you have to grab it and put it back on. So if it flies off into the room somewhere, you obviously have to go and collect that to put it back on there. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, I want you to look at the wake and shake alarm clock. See that little round thing that goes underneath your pillow? And when the alarm goes off, only a slightly less decibels than a jackhammer, that thing goes off and vibrates your head. It flashes with a strobe light to wake you up. Wake and shake. And if that wasn't enough, look at this one. This one's called Clocky. Clocky, if you even remotely reach over to hit the snooze on Clocky, it rolls off of your table, and it goes and hides somewhere in your room, and it blinks and makes noise until you get up and find it to stop it from making noise. Now, some of you have got some nice gifts for Christmas in mind now, don't you? I take us through this whole thing because you and I need to know that it's awfully easy in the world in which you and I live is just to hit the snooze, even in our spiritual lives, and go back to sleep. There's a part of us that looks at this old world of ours after the election and all the stuff and the elbowing and the poking and all the stuff that's going on is simply to say, oh, this is wonderful, or this is the second coming, this is the worst thing, this is Armageddon, and somewhere in between. And what I want you to do is to stop snoozing your way through life and to wake up to all that God has for you. The passage that I wanted to read for you today is one that's found in Romans 13. 11 through 14, and I'm reading it from the Message version, although when I reference it later, I'll be using the New American Standard. Romans 13:11. But make sure that you don't get so absorbed and exhausted in taking care of all your day-to-day obligations that you lose track of the time and doze off, oblivious to God. The night is about over, dawn is about to break. Be up and awake to what God is doing. God is putting the finishing touches on the salvation work that He began when we first believed. We can't afford to waste a minute, must not squander these precious daylight hours in frivolity and indulgence, in sleeping around and dissipation and bickering and grabbing everything in sight. Get out of bed and get dressed. Don't loiter and linger, waiting until the very last minute. Dress yourselves in Christ and be up and about. So, if you got your outline, want to follow along, awake from sleep. Paul is literally sounding the alarm and asking his people to wake up. Wake up in the spiritual sense. You have to imagine that Paul was a morning person. If you read much about Paul, you have to get the feeling that he was one intense dude and that he woke up with a ready in his hand to go about doing the task that God had placed before him. But he says something that just kind of, particularly if you look at it in the Greek, he says something there that kind of causes you to look. And he says in verse 11, you know what time it is. And if you look at the Greek, there are always two words that rotate around with time. And the word that he uses here is kairos. Now, the word kairos, we've talked about it a couple different times. It is the word speaking to opportunity. It is the word talking about something happening in that time, not just putting the time in. Chronology or chronos time is a little different. Chronos is when you go in and you put in the time. If you're paid by the hourly wage, you say, okay, 5 hours of work for 5 hours salary, that's chronological. But what if something happens during those 5 hours where God touches that moment and you say, wow, the time went fast, it was a good time. The other day, I mentioned it on a Wednesday night to my group. I really didn't even fully, I think, recognize how powerful this moment had been in my life. I had just gotten back from my vacation break, and I was in the office. I was kind of ready to go. I'd seen the stacks that were waiting on me, and I was ready to get about it. And sure enough, I turned the corner, and there was a young man that had, well, I say young man, he's probably late 40s, early 50s, but he looked, I mean, you could tell from the looks, from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, his life echoed with the word homeless. And so I thought, oh boy, here's one of those situations I'm going to have to deal with. But, you know, okay, I'm going to dive in and do my best. And sure enough, he began to introduce himself. I had him fill out a little bit of paperwork, and he wasn't homeless. He explained to me how he'd been here and all of that. He said, I got $19. He wanted to show it to me. I said, no, you don't need to do that. But there was something along the way where, you know, this guy's, he's really shooting straight with me and the situation that he's in. And so I began, okay, let's go. He needed to get to Clarksville, Tennessee, so took him to the Greyhound bus station. Now, let me just pause right there. When's the last time some of you were at the Greyhound bus station? Recently? You want a piece of life, go to Greyhound bus station. You want a slice of life, go to the Greyhound bus station. I mean, I've traveled on Greyhound buses before. Neva has traveled. You know, we've gone through that with certain situations. But I walked through there, hadn't been there for a while, and I noticed two things. First of all, almost nobody in there wants to make eye contact. Why? Because they're going somewhere. They're in a bad. Usually, it's not a great situation. But I also noticed there was a bunch of folks over in the corner that were all dressed in the black garb. You know, they were either Amish or, Mennonites or something. But what I noticed about them, and I'm trying not to be harsh on them, but boy, they had sour looks on their faces, and they were just kind of huddled together like, ooh, the world's over here, and we want to protect ourselves from them. And here I am walking through the Greyhound with this young man, and I'm just really big about trying to make eye contact with people, but really not a lot of people making eye contact. And so he and I were walking there, and I thought it was interesting. As soon as we got in front of the counter, he wanted to talk to the man behind the counter. And I thought, He says, you know what I used to do? And he'd already told me his story. He's bipolar, and he'd struggled with that for years, and now he was on disability and da-da-da-da-da. He said, I used to be a bus driver for Greyhound. And it was like he was telling his life story, because the guy, no matter what the other people in the room might think about him, he was valuable because in this guy's eyes, he did something this guy recognized. And first of all, I was impressed that the guy behind the counter engaged him and talked to him about his experience as one of those drivers. And then I felt a heaviness in my heart about his last point of identity with being a valuable person was connected to being a bus driver for Greyhound. Now let me tell you what, I spent about an hour with him, and you can lock that in on 1 hour chronological time. But it changed my whole day. Changed my whole day. Because it was opportunity time. It was Christ time. It was Kairos time. It was in a moment where I was allowed to understand everybody has a story, and they just want to tell their story, and they want to be loved. He hugged me rather awkwardly. Not that I'm not a good hugger, but he kind of fell into me after I gave him the ticket. And there we were standing in the middle of Greyhound with all those people looking the other direction, holding on to each other for a minute. I say all that to say that here was a man that needed some Kairos time. Now the chances are you and I are going to have opportunities this coming week, and over these next few weeks in particular. It's Advent, it's Christmas season. Everybody is sensitized to what they have and they don't have. They're sensitized to how thankful they could be and how incredibly ungrateful they could be. And so you and I will have an opportunity to answer Paul's question, do you know what time it is? Also, Paul knew, as he says in verse 11, now is the moment for you to wake from your sleep. What Paul is wanting to remind us is that there are two times. There is the time that we can see and know before we accepted Christ and knew Christ, and there's the time afterwards where we're going to meet Christ again someday. And that we live in the tension of in between those two moments. And what he's saying is, don't fall asleep, but be awake and know what time it is. So next, sleep and spiritual inattentiveness. You see, New Testament and the New Testament world often use the word sleep as a kind of metaphor or picture for spiritual inattentiveness. Jesus referenced it. He talked about his followers. He warned his followers about being spiritual snoozers. Paul here argues in verse 12, the night is far gone, the day is near, and salvation is nearer to us than when we became believers. He's holding that tension, and he's reminding us. And what he wants us to do is to remember that point where for most of us, we came to know Christ. We were baptized. It was that moment when we were put into the water and lifted out of the water, and that memory, that mark, was the point at which we said our old life is being buried and our new life is being raised. Now, there's nothing magical about the water, but there is something powerful about the mystery of accepting Christ. For me, at least, fortunately, I get to be able to baptize folks in this baptismal, knowing that I myself began my own journey at age 18 in that particular baptistry. So what he's asking us to do is reflect upon the moment when we were baptized and to use our remembering and our forgiveness that we received, that we ought to be offering that, and that we understand that through everyday living that experience and remembering it. And again, he gives a list of things in verses 13 and 14. Now, the ones that he lists there are wild parties, drinking, sexual immorality. Those things are typically not what most members of churches have a difficult with, but it's the second half of those. It's the interpersonal issues that they have a problem with. The quarreling and the jealousy and what we call the interpersonal difficulties that come from having to write. The way in which Paul says we need to take care of that is he says, put on the armor of Christ. He's saying, put on Christ. When you get out of bed, when you feel like you're falling asleep during the middle of the day, when you've gotten drowsy and groggy from the heaviness that life gives you, then wake yourself up and put on Christ. So how do we put on Christ? That's the next kind of punchline there. How do we put on Christ? I love the story of the mother who has two young children. Now let me remind you, this is a mother with two young children. So you kind of get a picture of what she does every day. She was putting them to bed, and she went to prepare herself for bed. So she'd gotten them settled in, and so she goes in and does what she does pretty much every night. She puts on some old clothes, and she goes to the bathroom, and she washes her hair, wraps her hair in a towel, and then she is getting ready to clean her makeup off, and so she applies that cold cream, put that cream on, and the cream is smeared all over her face when she hears the kids disruptive and screaming and playing and messing around in the rooms, and she's frustrated. She goes into the room and she looks at those two small children and says, you get in your bed, you fall, you get to sleep, and I'm not going to have to come back in here again. And she slams the door, but just before the door slams, she hears one of the trembling voices of the kids saying, who was that? And what she was thinking was that there is a disguise that we wear sometimes, but at the end of the day, what better thing for people to say to us is who we are, and that who we are is that we are picture, we're glimpses, we are possibilities for the presence of Christ. We want our lives always to exhibit that Jesus is sticking out all over the place in our lives. How do we do that? We put on Jesus. We put on Jesus by reflecting about our baptism and our forgiveness and our repentance, and we walk in the forgiveness that he's given us in our new birth, remembering what it is that he's given us. I've often thought, I can't remember if somebody told me this, but I've often thought when we have baptism, maybe even communion sometime, I ought to get my friend Ed Curran, who runs the funeral home locally, to bring in a casket, and to have the casket in the front of the church open, and to have everybody come by. Maybe I shouldn't tell you to do this. Maybe I should just do this one Sunday. But have everybody come by and look inside the casket and have a mirror set up where you can see yourself. Nobody's coming to church that Sunday, are you? But to look into that and think about, reflect about your old life, buried, and your new life, resurrected. So maybe over here we ought to have a casket. Maybe here we'll make us a cave that reminds us that Jesus walked out of the cave and that he was resurrected. First time you come to church and you see those things set up, you're probably going to do it you're going to go out the other door. I know you. One of the guys that I read this week had an interesting idea about this whole waking up in the morning and what he would do in the morning. His name is Reverend Adam Hamilton. He's a Methodist pastor in Kansas. He talks about what he calls a prayer shower. And so what he has done is he has put little prayer on what kind of like a plastic luggage tag, and he encourages folks to hang it in their shower, and as they're taking their shower, they read the prayer, and he goes like this: Lord, as I enter the water to bathe, I remember my baptism. Wash me by your grace, fill me with your spirit, renew my soul. I pray that I might live as your child today and honor you in all that I do. Wouldn't be a bad thing to do, would it? Wouldn't be a bad thought to have. Sure, it would remind us of some things. This week I've been looking for some encouragement. I've been making my way around, particularly around this whole idea of waking up and not sleeping through this, what I would call a fairly difficult time in our country and in our world. And I found someone that you will know the name, but let me give you his quote first. One of the great liabilities of history is that all too many people fail to remain awake through great periods of social change. He says every society has its protectors of the status quo and the fraternities of the indifferent, who are notorious for sleeping through revolutions. But today, our very survival depends on our ability to do these things. And he lists them: to stay awake, to adjust to new ideas, to remain vigilant, and to face the challenge of change. He concludes, the large house in which we live demands that we transform this worldwide neighborhood into a worldwide brotherhood. And I would add to that, sisterhood. Together we must learn to live as brothers and sisters, or together we will be forced to perish as fools. Now, you know, we celebrate this week the most famous story of all time in terms of people who learn to live through difficulty. I heard on a podcast this week, my friend Stephen Mansfield, every year, the week before Thanksgiving, he tells the story of Thanksgiving, and he tells it in a way that I've never quite heard. At least he collects some of the details I'd never heard. So let me walk through that experience with you. It must have been an incredibly horrifying experience. Though they were slightly more than just over 100 people on the Mayflower, only 54 of those were the band of what we called separatists who had lived in Holland and who now, the previous 12 years, they had fled, they were escaping the persecution in England. So they were farmers, they were shepherders, and some even were craftsmen. And so they had never, ever been on a boat, on a ship of any kind. Now imagine that. Imagine you and me who've not been on boats very often. So it must have seemed like they were on a place that was similar to the demons of hell when they took off in the fall of that year 1620. The storms of the North Atlantic were so fierce that the ship tossed the main mast, often dipped over completely into the waves. And they were so disoriented and so their stomach overturning from the experience that they were obviously very, very sick. This small band of believers, men, women, expectant mother, and small children were among them. They were, in fact, in what they called the tween deck. That was the deck for fear that many of them, because they were sick, they wouldn't want to put them on the top. They would lose them. They would go into the water, which, by the way, we wouldn't live very long in that colder water. It was a filthy, smelly, terrifying time. The elements were not only in opposition to Christians, but there was a man on that they later wrote in their history about, a man who referenced these people who would later be called the Pilgrims. He referenced them as psalm-singing puke stockings. Now, he called them that for two reasons. They sang a lot of psalms and they puked a lot. And so there they were referencing that. What I found interesting also as I read the story, of all the people that were on the boat, the only one that died was the one who called them that name, by the way. 66 days they were on that little ship. The size of that ship was about the size of a modern-day volleyball court. Now that's not very big. And there they made their way from England over to the coast of Massachusetts. That wasn't where they had actually planned to land, by the way. William Bradford, who later became the governor of that little group, this is what he told about them. He says, being thus past the vast ocean and a sea of troubles before, in their preparation, they now had no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain them or to refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no house or much less towns to repair to seek. What could sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, our fathers were Englishmen, which came over this great ocean and were ready to perish in the wilderness. Now you know what happened that first winter, don't you? It was called the starving time. 5 kernels of corn was what they had placed on their tables that first time. They interacted with the Indians, you remember that, Squanto and Somerset. The white man had to learn to harvest, and so after that first year, which many of them died, they made their way through, and so They gathered for that first Thanksgiving that we now know and celebrate, and there they were with their Indian friends who joined them with 5 freshly killed deer. The white women gathered their cornmeal pudding and a variety of vegetables, while the Indians brought the delicacies with fruits like blueberries and apples and cherries. But my favorite of all was the fact that the Indians taught these pilgrims to place these little corn kernels into a earthen pot and cook them and produce what we now know as popcorn. Little did they know we would microwave it all these many years later. It was indeed for them a Thanksgiving time. I tell you that story again because I'm stirred by it, but I'm also reminded of their purpose. Do you know what their purpose was? You think they were running from something, or were they running for something? I think they were running for something. Their stated purpose, if you read their history, was this: they came for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, for propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world. Yea, though they should be but even as stepping stones unto others for the performing of so great a work. I think it would behoove us to take their mission to our hearts and to our minds. To remember that people will be sitting around tables all this week, everywhere throughout much of the world, but I wonder how many of them will know the reason the pilgrims crossed across that great ocean, because they had a burning in their heart to tell others about Christ. Let's don't fall asleep. Let's stay vigilant. Let's stay ever focused. And let's alarm the alarm of Christ by putting on Christ in our hearts and living that experience, so that nobody ever wonders who we are. We are God people. We are Christian, Christ walking, Christ living, Christ breathing